Taking time out of your day today to join us. We are very grateful that you are here with us today. A few things I want to make sure you know before we begin. We will have certificates of attendance, so I will put a link more than likely in the Q&A box since it's the one that's working. And you can find that at the bottom of the Zoom screen, right about the middle. Just click that Q&A and it will open that. And you can put questions in there. People have been sharing where they are and their titles for me. And so it just gives you a way to access me to ask questions. And I can answer some of those, and we will save some of those for Dr. Burns at the end of her session today. So there will be a link for that certificate of attendance. There will be a link to access the recording and the slide deck used today. And then I'll also have a link that gives you access to a survey. We would greatly appreciate you completing that survey for us. And that gives us information for future webinars. And we really appreciate that. So let me introduce Dr. Burns to you. Dr. Burns is an adjunct, I can't even talk today, associate professor at Northwestern University, and she's authored 4 books and over 100 journal articles on the neuroscience of language and communication. Her expertise is in all areas related to neuroscience of learning, such as language and reading in the brain, the bilingual brain, and the language to literacy continuum, and the adolescent brain. Dr. Martha Burns is a fellow of the American Speech and Language Hearing Association and the director of neuroscience education for Carnegie Learning. Marty, I will turn it over to you.
Okie doke, great. I'm just welcome everyone. I'm thrilled that you're here. I can't wait to share all the new research. The biggest problem I have, to be honest with you, is there's so much new research. Getting it into an hour is not going to be easy, or 15 minutes to leave you with questions. So I will be talking pretty fast today to cover it all. But if we can't get to all the questions at the end, Corey and others will send the questions to me, and I promise I will answer them for you. So let's get started. And what we're going to cover today, we're going to start with how the brain reads. So we're going to look at all the new research on the brain regions involved, first in language, because as far as the brain is concerned, reading is language. And then we're going to see how reading, the power of reading to actually build the brain in very different ways than oral language does, and then all the specific regions and connections. Then we're going to look at specific dyslexia research. There's a brand new body of research now. We're going to start with a historical perspective because that's where most people come in, but I want to talk about how we have now what's called a multi-factor approach in understanding dyslexia, that there are lots of different components of dyslexia that we need to look at and address. But we also want to understand that students who have trouble learning to read have strengths. And oftentimes those strengths are incredible, and some very remarkable people in the world were dyslexic, and we'll talk about that. Then what we want to talk about is underlying factors. In the past, what we've tried to look at is, okay, a person who's having trouble reading can't do this. Let's say they can't decode or they can't attach meaning to a word. So let's do more work on that. Let's work on that skill. Let's work on decoding. What we've learned is that there are reasons that they can't decode. There are reasons that they're having trouble attaching meaning to words. And to understand the reasons, we can get at the issues a lot faster and a lot more efficiently. So that's where all the research is, and there's tons of it that I'm going to be going through today. But one of the big areas that has been studied for several years and now has really come to the forefront is differences in how we perceive sounds and perceive incoming information in general. And we'll talk about that and how that has now taken a forefront in our understanding of dyslexia. We're also going to talk about the brain. I am a neuroscientist, so that's where I go to understand the why of dyslexia. What are the differences in the brains of individuals who have dyslexia? What are some of the connection differences? And how can we change that? Because guess what? The human brain is plastic. It changes. And that's why teaching works. And that's why interventions work. And we're also going to focus on individual differences. There aren't two children with dyslexia that are exactly the same. And we're learning that. There's a lot of variability. And we want to understand that because we want to be able to match our interventions to the unique needs of every single student. So we're going to talk about then best practices. That's why you're all here today, I know. But what do the new science, brain science interventions help us with in terms of understanding how to be more effective with students who have dyslexia so they can read more effectively, faster, more efficiently, and get through school very successfully, and what instructional approaches are best. So with that, we're going to start with, as the neuroscientist here, the contribution of brain science. And the first thing I want you to know is the human brain is very complex. And there was a researcher years ago who said, is the human brain capable of understanding the human brain? Because it's very complex. You probably know we have 80 billion neurons. And that's a lot of neurons. That's a lot of connections. But each of us has a different organization. And somebody gave me the best example the other day. I've never used it before, but we look at everybody's different faces and we say, oh, I know who that is. I recognize your face. You have blue eyes and you have brown hair and you have a mustache and you have rounded cheeks. We all have different faces, and yet somehow we thought the brains of everybody were the same. So these complex 80 billion neurons are very differently organized, very differently working in different ways for all of us, which is what makes us all special and unique. But it also makes it a little difficult when a student's having trouble to know the best way to approach what they're doing. And that's where we go into trying to look at the brain and brain differences. So this was research last year. If you attended this webinar last year, what you saw was this research that on the top, what you see is the parts of the brain that are involved when we are talking. So when you're sitting, listening to me today, the left hemisphere of your brain, I can take my hand and put it right around my ear there, and that area is very active as you're listening to this talk. And it's active if you move forward a little bit in the brain, it's very active if you were talking yourself. And we've known that for many, many years. But look at the power of reading. Look at now these are adults who are literate, but look at the lower right-hand corner, and what you see is the brain has many more places now that are activated when someone is reading. For one thing, the first line that you see there is pointing to the back of the brain, back here, the visual part of the brain. Reading links vision to sound. So we get along pretty well just in language, even if we can't see real well, as you know, but we can't read. So you have to link vision to sound, but also reading builds up the front part of the brain, which is, we call it the prefrontal cortex, but it's the part of the brain that enables you to do the harder thing, enables you to plan and organize and be very strategic in what you do and have strategies for handling problems. And reading builds that skill. And you can see that part of the brain, that frontal lobe part of the brain build up. And you can also see a part right back here, right behind my ear, that is very important for social skills. You don't think of reading as building social skills. You think, wow, kids sitting reading their book all by themselves, sitting in the corner, they're not social. But it turns out reading does help us take the perspective of others. That's called theory of mind. But my ability to take the perspective of an author versus this character versus that character in a novel, that helps me to be a more compassionate human being and be able to understand different viewpoints in the real world. Now, brain research is constantly being updated. So that was last year's slides. Look what we have now. This came out a month ago, the talking brain. And what you see is, yes, the same areas that we saw before. If we go back to this slide at the upper right-hand corner, you can see all the same areas light up, nothing new. Well, it turns out what these researchers did is they looked at 403 studies that had been done of speech and language and went through them with a fine-tooth comb. And what they found is it's not a uniform area of the brain that's activated when you're talking or listening, but 4 major areas are activated, and they're different. One area is very important for grammar. So one area is very important for understanding the difference between the boy hit the ball and the ball hit the boy. All of that is just which came first, which was the subject and which was the object. Now make it more complex and say the sphere that was traveling through the air at 62 miles an hour was being accelerated as it approached the child who was standing there with the... All of that requires grammar. Then we have meaning. We have to know what a sphere is. If we don't know what a sphere is, we have no understanding that that was a ball. Then we have phonology. We have to be able to hear all the sounds, and we have to process all the sounds separately. And we have to know if there's a past tense or a present tense. If I say the boy hits the ball versus the boy hit the ball, or the boys hit the ball versus the boy hit the ball, you have to process those sounds. And then finally, we have to understand intonational contour. It's called prosody. I have to know, is someone asking a question or are they making a statement? Is the dyslexia webinar today versus is the dyslexia webinar today? All of that is just sounds. And all of those areas of the brain have to be working seamlessly together, and they're processing the information that way. But another article just came out, and this is a whole journal now that came out last week. So I had, after I built this talk for you, I had to go back in and say, oh, I got to add this stuff. Whole journal, the Journal of Experimental Child Psychology, on the connections between oral language and word reading and spelling. And all that we've learned just in the last 6 months about how language supports reading and how reading is dependent on language skills. So what these articles talk about is how learning to read and spell are among the most important skills to be acquired in a child, because they're going to support all learning after that. And that language itself has cognitively very complex skills, but reading adds more complexity. And reading isn't innate. Oral language we learn if we're exposed to it, but reading, for almost all of us, we have to be taught. And it's a complex task. And rather than appear to be just built on oral language, what we're learning is that sound and print and meaning all have different components to being able to master them. And those components have to be part of our reading instruction and certainly part of our assessments when we're assessing a child who's having trouble. So the special issue explores all the interconnections and all the new research between reading and spelling and language itself and sounds and grammar and meaning. So we take all of this and we say, okay, so what we've got then is this human brain that enables us to learn to read. And once we learn to read, it becomes empowered with all of these different skills. So aren't we all the same once we learn how to read? And it turns out, no, we aren't. There's tremendous variability. Even those of us who read well read differently and have different strengths. And so our brains develop differently, just like our face does, based on our genes. I mean, your face and my hair and your hair and my body type are all based on what I inherited, but also things I do. Obviously, I'm old enough that I can admit to you that I color my hair. Otherwise, it would be very white. So, and all of us are different that way. And we're different because we have different genes, but we're also different because we have different experiences. Experiences affect the genes. We know that, for example, if you have some certain kinds of genes and you smoke, smoking causes those genes to cause cancer. Whereas if you don't have those genes, you could smoke and not get cancer. We've known that for years, and that's called epigenetics. But all of our experiences also mold the brain and build the brain in different ways. Each of us have different experiences. We have different cultures. We have different backgrounds. We have different family orientations. Some of us came from homes where there were lots of books and lots of reading. Some children don't have that advantage. And all of that affects the way the brain matures and develops long before a child gets into school and then even afterwards. So what we know is that there's a genetic impact on all of the learning capacities we have, but grammar and syntax and phonology and this melody of speech all are affected by our socioeconomic situation, by dialectal differences, by first language differences, by what we call adverse childhood experiences. And now we have the pandemic to add to it. We have students who have been sitting at home and not getting the same kind of socialization and the same kind of instruction for a couple of years. And we see dramatic effects on our educational outcomes because of these differences. And the effects are also part of the brain. Now add the aspect we've talked about language and how important language is. Now add this visual component we talked about. Reading requires you to link a visual stimulus with all of this language, this oral language ability. And it too is much more complicated than we ever thought. So we've known for years, this is a slide of Stanislaus Dehaene's from his book, Reading in the Brain. We've known for years that the back of the brain, those red dots you see back here at the back, are about vision. And those red dots, those areas, have to have connections to those green areas that are the oral language areas for someone to be able to read. Now that sounds kind of silly and simple, right? Except it isn't, because if I recognize an object, like in this case, I can recognize a horse, doesn't matter whether the horse is facing left or right. It doesn't matter whether it's facing down or up. I could even leave out some components of the horse, maybe leave out its eyes in one case, and you still know it's a horse from the silhouette. But it's not true of letters. It's not true of words. If all I have to do is change that little line from the left to the right side of the circle, or change it so the circle's at the top or the bottom, and you have 4 different letters, B, Q, D, P, or words. All I have to do is double the letter O, or double the letter G, or change the G to a B, and I have 3 entirely different words. And that's vision. So we're going to play a little game together. And we're going to read this together, and we're going to try to figure out how this word thing works. And I've got this stuff that's in the way, so we'll try it this way. I can't read it very well. I was going to have us read it all together. Maybe if I move this here. Okay, so I'm going to read. I have a line cutting here. Maybe I can get rid of it, but I can't. There. Okay, so let's just read it together. You guys can read with me, and we'll just read this paragraph. According to a research study at Cambridge University, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word are. The only important thing is that the first and last letter be in the right place. The rest can be totally a mess, and you can still read it without a problem. This is because the human mind doesn't really care and read every letter by itself, but the word as a whole. Now, what happened is, and you can see the link there where I got that, and you can go in and get it yourself. This was published online. Whoops, for some reason it's not moving. About 3 years ago, or about 10 years ago, sorry, on the internet. And it starts with Cambridge University. So it's apparently surprised researchers at Cambridge, and especially Matt Davis, who was especially working on the cognitive brain sciences unit at Cambridge, because he didn't do this and he didn't have this research. And he states, this is his quote, "There are elements of truth in this, but also some things which scientists study as to the psychology of language known to be incorrect. Most strikingly, a recent paper showed that 11% slowing when people read words that had reordered internal letters. And hopefully what you noticed is I misread some of the words, and I had to go back and reread a couple of them. So even though could I read it? Yes, and I'm an experienced adult reader. Obviously, letter order is important to some extent, and it slows us down if we have to read it. And that is not the case. But the key of this, what this all means, is for those of us who are good readers and know how to read well, we don't need to read letter by letter anymore. We don't need to sound words out. We can go directly from word to meaning, even if a word is misspelled or jumbled. And for example, how often do you text, or how often do you write an email to someone and you have a misspelling that you didn't notice, or that you did a typo that you just didn't notice, even when you read it carefully. And by the way, even newspaper editors sometimes miss major typos in headlines. And here's one that it's not the human brain, it's human Brian is still evolving. And a newspaper totally missed it with all the editors. So can we read without decoding every sound as an adult? Of course. But obviously decoding is important, especially if the word's unfamiliar to us, especially if the word, if we have a complex sentence that we're working through. So reading is complex. There's a lot to it. And to simplify it too much means that we're going to have students who don't read well. And that's where we're going now. Dyslexia. Okay, what is dyslexia? And let's just start with an article that just came out again. This was just published a couple months ago in one of the journals, the brain journals. And he talks about, what Stein talks about is theories of dyslexia. This is a historical way we've looked at it, trying to simplify it, which is what humans do. We want to make it simple enough that we can do something about it. And for years, what we had was called the phonological theory of dyslexia, that students who have trouble reading have trouble decoding. They have trouble sounding words out, and they have trouble even hearing the sounds in words, phonological awareness, knowing that the word cat has 3 phonemes, cat, for example, and rhymes with bat. And that's a very strong theory, and a lot of students with dyslexia do have that, but doesn't tell why do they have that? Why is that a problem? Because if the way that we try to intervene with a student with dyslexia is to give them more of what's hard for them, what we're doing is just making them repeat over and over again activities that are difficult and frustrating and aggravating, and often they get discouraged. Now, a second theory came out. It was part of what was called the double deficit hypothesis. Marianne Wolf showed that a lot of students who have reading problems also have problems naming quickly. And if you can't name quickly, if I say, tell me as many animals as you can in a minute, and the person can't name those animals, then what quickly, and they go, lion and tiger, and did I say lion? A lot of students with dyslexia have trouble with that. But is that the cause of the reading problem? And if we work on it, is it going to help the student? Again, we need to understand why they have that and what the contribution of it is to the reading. And then finally, there have been theories for years about reduced visual skills, especially visual attention span, that students who have reading problems tend to jump all over the page visually. They don't follow a line on a page from left to right smoothly, so that they'll jumble up a word. The word was may be read as saw, a B might be read as a D, and so on. But again, that doesn't explain why. And so where we are now is to understand dyslexia, is to know the why, because then we can figure out what are the most effective and efficient interventions. And there are lots of studies now, as you can tell how much I'm rushing with this, that show it's not a single mechanism. It isn't one certain problem. There are visual problems in some students. Most students do have these auditory phonological problems, but there are other components, and we need to understand it in more depth. And why do they have them? That's the big thing. And the current view right now, if you look at the new research, is that underlying the ability to decode, to sound words out, and to be able to identify which sounds are in the word cat and which sounds are in the word bat and whether they rhyme, underlying all of that phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is what we call temporal processing, auditory temporal processing. Now, what in the heck is that, lady? Why are you throwing these terms out with all these words? Well, turns out that we have been looking at temporal processing disorders for a while. Cognitive psychologists have, and one of them who started over 40 years ago was a woman whose name was Paula Talal at Rutgers. And she was looking at children who have developmental language problems, who have trouble learning language. And she thought there might be a sequencing problem. They might have trouble sequencing the word stop, for example, and say sop or top instead of stop. And so she was looking at sequencing of sounds. And what she discovered is that the children with language problems could sequence sounds very easily if they were slow. Beep, beep. They could go, oh, I heard that. Beep, beep. But when they got really fast, they weren't able to do it. She went, this is interesting. And it turns out that those neural timing differences underlie that. And I'll explain that. So I threw another term at you, neural timing differences. And what is that, for heaven's sakes? Well, you know, neurons fire in your brain, and some of them fire real fast and some of them fire slowly. If I want to recognize what this is, I don't need fast neurons. I can just look at it. I can take my time. I can say, well, it seems to be glass. It seems to have a little water in it. It seems there's a reflection there, but I think it's a glass. Okay. And I can look at it as long as I need to. But what if I'm a pro baseball player and what I have to do is take a baseball bat and hit a ball coming at me that is, by the way, I just learned this, preparing for this course, being pitched at me at 100 miles an hour. Professional pitchers throw balls 100 miles an hour. Now, I don't know about you, but what I will tell you is if someone threw a ball at me at 100 miles an hour and I hit a bat, the last thing I would be able to do is figure out when that ball was going to get to the point where I could hit it with a bat. What I would do is this, and that's it, okay? I would hide, I would duck, I would get out of the way. And hopefully I could do that fast enough. Because I don't have visual neurons that process information that quickly. I know I don't. So why were we talking about this with speech and reading? Well, it turns out speech moves very, very quickly. A consonant sound is just hundredths of a second long. We can have 4 or 5 different consonants within a second, and with a vowel in there that's even longer. And we have to be able to process all of them. So think of it as a baseball going 100 miles an hour, only it's speech sounds going that fast. Now, what is it like if speech is going that fast and you can't process it that quickly? I have a link here I was going to share with you. But what I discovered today when I was practicing this is when I go into the link, I end up with about 5 minutes of advertisements. So I will just leave the link for you to explore. But what I'm going to do is imitate what it's like for somebody who's having trouble processing speech quickly. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to change my eyes a little bit. I'm reminded by the way that I talk about how, because I'm a good kid, sometimes say the words come out exactly as I want, but you're not get them. And why didn't you get them? Because I changed all of the sounds timing enough that it distorted it. Now, if my brain is used to processing at a certain rate, speech, and you listen to another rate, like listening to a great British show on TV, what do? Well, if you're like me, what you do is you turn on the captions underneath and you read it because you can't follow it. And for students, think of students who have temporal processing issues. Students with temporal processing issues are often that way. They can't hear it all. So when we talk to them, we may say, Billy, go upstairs, would you, and grab your coat and don't forget to close the window because I think it's going to rain and we've got to hurry to school. And Billy goes, what? Huh? Go upstairs, Billy, get your coat and close the window. We got to go to school. Get my coat and what, Mom? Close the window. Now, why was that hard? He was listening, but it was going quickly, and there was a lot of information in there, and he couldn't process it fast enough. So what we've learned about the human brain is if it can't process the information of ours fast enough, then learning to speak is sometimes difficult. It's not always, but think of that rapid auditory naming. If your brain is moving more slowly with sound, then it's going to take you a little longer to think of words too. And that would explain why a student might have trouble telling the difference between and the difference in other differences as well, that the sounds sound too much alike, just like that ball moving at me so quickly that I can't organize myself around it. I don't know where it's going to be in time. I just have to get out of the way. So this complex brain of ours then has some cells that fire very fast, and they are the cells that you have to use to develop to be able to speak, to be able to hear speech, understand speech. And if we learn a second language, what do? We have to redevelop the skill in the second language too. Have you ever taken a dictation in French? Dictée? I used to hate those because they went so fast and I couldn't write everything down. And those cells have a name, and they're called magnocells. And they're called magnocells because they're big. Big cells in the brain fire very quickly, it turns out. But we have other cells that you need too. You don't just need rapid firing cells. If all I had was rapid firing cells, I'd be great at hitting baseballs, but I wouldn't be very good at a lot of other things that move more slowly, just recognizing a face, for example. So when a student has a lot of magnocells, then other kinds of cells may not develop as much. And the converse is true. The smaller cells, called parvocells, process information as a whole. Parvocells process slowly, but they enable me to see this whole room. They enable me to see the pictures behind me. They enable me to see the desks. They enable me to see the walls. I can see the whole room. And that's because those cells process more slowly and take in a lot of information. We call that holistic processing. Now, it turns out there's a fiber track in the brain that goes from your ear, and you can see it below. That's going from this ear into the central part of the brain that's going to channel information up for listening and understanding what you hear. And that big fat fiber track that you see there are magnocells. Those are cells that process speech very well because they process very quickly. But you can see that individuals with dyslexia, we've known for years, that fiber track isn't as well developed. But guess what? They have other cells. So what we've learned is that if you don't have a lot of magnocells, one of the things that happens is you often have a lot of parvocells instead. Okay, so what does that mean? What that means is because of those slow cells, you may see the world as a whole very differently. You might be very, very artistic, for example. You might be able to see a scene and see the colors and the lights and the shapes and be able to reproduce that with oils or watercolors to highlight shape and form and size all in one big picture. That's a whole different skill than doing let's say, an algebraic equation where you have to look at every single detail, or reading a long paragraph where you have to look at every sound. Okay. So often students with dyslexia, we're now starting to see, have the advantage of this other network that develops, and those neurons enable skills that some of the rest of us don't have. So the parvocells then proliferate. And what does that mean? Well, if you have auditory parvocellular perception, you're good at listening to things like melodies and chords. Did you know that? Because that's holistic. But what you might not be very good at is something like hearing rhythm. And I'm sure that wasn't very good, but so you wouldn't become a drummer. But what might you become? You might become somebody who can play the piano by chords, by ears. And I bring that up because my grandmother was dyslexic, I'm pretty sure, long before they diagnosed dyslexia. And she could play the most complex songs you have ever heard totally by ear, but she could not read a musical note. She could not read music. So it seems that the parvocellular proliferation then gives individuals with dyslexia a talent in addition, and skills in addition to the struggles they have with reading. And the reason this is important is if we discourage them in school, if we say, I don't think you're as smart as the other kids because you're really having trouble learning to read, or if they just feel that way, if they feel like, well, he's smart because he can read and I'm not smart because I can't read, and it takes me longer to do my homework and it takes me longer to do all this other stuff. then that student may get discouraged and not achieve what they're capable of. But it turns out that dyslexics are great at judging personality. They're great at taking factors into account when they're working with people and coming to accurate conclusions. And so guess who some very brilliant dyslexic people were? Turns out that Albert Einstein was dyslexic. It turns out that Caesar Augustus was dyslexic. Leonardo da Vinci, apparently, Winston Churchill, Steven Spielberg. Okay, they all had tremendous talents, but they couldn't read. So what does this mean then? What it means is that we all have different brains. Some genetic neurobiological differences lead to trouble learning to read. And we call that dyslexia if it's fairly profound. But there's also the new way they're talking about it, and I took this from the Stein article, is positive dyslexia. There are large literature suggesting that people with dyslexia are overrepresented in being artistic and entrepreneurial business people, practical engineering, and no surprise, mathematicians and computer scientists. All right, so what does this help us with the reading instruction, Marty, for heaven's sakes? All right. The way that we tried to simplify it, and Scarborough is brilliant for doing this, is he said, hey, look, let's just try to take this complex task and look at the basic elements. And he called it the simple view of reading. That if we can just get students to decode and have phonological awareness skills so they can recognize words on the one hand and then understand both the words themselves, the vocabulary, and the grammar, that's reading. And if we work on all of that, we will have solved the problem. Well, obviously, that's not enough because we haven't solved the problem. And we now have schools around the country that are reporting NAEP scores where 40 to 50% of students are not reading at grade level, both elementary and high school. Now, for years, we had the National Reading Panel study this. And where are they with that? Well, they still say, yes, alphabetics is important. Phonemic awareness instruction, phonics instruction has to be included in our reading and in any intervention. We have to consider fluency, though. We have to make sure that the students are able to read quickly and accurately. And we have to make sure we work on comprehension, as the Scarborough approach does stress as well. But there's another aspect they're adding now. And that's the importance of computer technology in reading instruction. Why? Because it can adapt to students individually, it can work with them one-on-one more efficiently and faster, and it can augment what we do as teachers. I don't think computers are ever going to substitute for teachers. Human beings love to be talked to by other human beings, but computer technology can go in and identify where the student's having trouble, the why of the reading component, and exercise that specifically. That has led to Duke and Cartwright's active view of reading that looks at reading, okay, not as simply as we might like, but that reading difficulties have lots of causes, and we have to look at all the competencies and difficulties beyond the simple view, or we're going to be missing 20 or 30% of our students. And that's what's been happening. So word recognition and language comprehension aren't entirely separate. And we have this need for this prefrontal capacity to regulate ourselves, to be organized, to be strategic, to be able to predict. So they have developed what they refer to as the active view of reading. It includes a simple view, the language comprehension in red, and the blue is alphabetics. Yes, those are essential. That's a simple view. But there are also bridging processes between those. Students have to understand print concepts. They have to have a knowledge of grammar, prefixes and suffixes and word orders. And they also have to be able to read fluently. And they've added the green circle. The green circle is cognitive skills. They have to be motivated, they have to be engaged, but they also have to be able to remember what they've read. They have to be able to attend to it. They have to be organized and plan ahead. So the new research now says, yes, what we have is these basic components of reading, But we also have to understand that underlying those are working memory, the ability to hold sounds in mind and words in mind. And if you want to think of what working memory is, just imagine going to the grocery store without your list where you left it at home, and you have to kind of try to go through and make a list in your head. And maybe you do it with initials, but you use strategies. So working memory involves a strategic way to remember information and hold it in the short term. Students also have to attend, and those two go together. And then all of these other processing skills, the ability to process speech quickly and accurately. And the heck do you work on that, by the way? And how do you work on syntax and semantics and phonology and prosody that underlie all of this for these students? Well, what we need is a multifaceted approach, and Mary Ann Wolf has been the advocate of this for years. For successful reading outcomes, we have to know which of these components a student's struggling with and adapt our intervention specifically to that student's needs. So reading mastery requires multiple capacities, interventions that provide individualized approaches to identify and target every student's unique strengths and any issues that they might have that are interfering with reading. That will include, yes, alphabetics, phonics, and grammar and comprehension. It will include fluency, but will also include, it has to include attentional skills, working memory skills, and this temporal processing, this ability to handle audition very quickly. And sometimes people talk about that as listening skills. Okay, so knowing that, how can we tell if an intervention does that? Well, it turns out that Chill and colleagues a year and a half ago published research showing which kinds of reading interventions are the most successful. If you look at which students are successful after an intervention, which dyslexic students are successful. What you see in the upper left-hand side up there, A, is the parts of the brain active in reading, and we've already been looking at that. What you see over on B on the upper right-hand side is how those correlate as students get better and better at reading. And what you see circled at the bottom is those aspects of brain processing that when they are built, the outcomes are for atypical readers, individuals with dyslexia, the outcomes are successful. And we're going to revisit this in a minute. When this first was announced, this dyslexia webinar, some people wrote me and said, are there any good screeners out there? I want to know if my child might have dyslexia, or is there a way that our school can diagnose it quickly and easily, even before children enter school? And what I want to take you to is Nadine Gabb's Reading Lab has a list of screeners available, but Nadine Gabb's Reading Lab also has their own screener, and they call it the Early Literacy Screener. And I put the link in for you so you can go there, and parents can use it, and so can schools, and have access to it. So now that we've talked about screening, we've identified a student that may be having trouble. Can we intervene and cover everything? And the answer is yes. If you have computer technology that covers all of these components, exercises that work on phonology, exercises that work on alphabetics, with fun characters, animated rewards, real-time progress, adapting. So if a student is going quickly, they don't need to work on that anymore. They can work on the areas where they need a little more time. The why. If it also builds in vocabulary and comprehension, recognizing words and grammar. So if the student's having trouble there, especially English language learners, you're building those skills with meaningful gamification again and sophisticated instruction, which technology can offer. Then embed working memory exercises on all of these exercises. So they have to hold it in mind. And so they have to attend to it and reward them when they remember it and reward them when they pay attention and they stick with it. For all of these decoding and vocabulary exercises and even vision. In this case, this is an exercise you can click on that link and you can see words fly across the page, sight words, and the student has to follow the words, but they hear a word and then they have to match the word that they're seeing. So it's also working on visual processing. The outcome is, from neuroscience research, shows that if you do that kind of intervention with students, what you have on the left is brain scans of typical reading 7-year-olds. On the far left, those are students who aren't having trouble with reading. In the middle, what you see are students who have reading disturbances. And in that point in that study, they were diagnosed as dyslexic. And you can see 2 areas don't light up, those areas where the red circle is and the blue circle. And then what you see is this was after about 8 to 10 weeks of working on these exercises. Now, they did it very intensely. You don't have to do it that intensely, but it would take a little longer. After students did this 5 days a week, very intensively for several weeks, the areas that lit up, you can see those 2 areas, the red and the blue circle area, light up now in the students who were struggling, meaning their brain is ready to learn. You got to the why. And now they can benefit from the instruction. But you also see the visual word form area light up. That's a green area. And you can see another area that's circled in brown light up that's activated. Does that matter? Well, let's go to this study that was done by Chill et al. Turns out those are the 4 areas that predict whether an intervention is going to be successful. So yes, we have the evidence, the neuroscience evidence that says, yes, we can do it. We can reach all the kids. We can adapt to each individual student. Now, they still need to be taught to read. They're still going to need curriculum, an excellent curriculum and excellent teachers, but they're ready to read. And this is an example, a case study, if you will, of someone I know very well personally. Her name is Camille Burns, so you might guess why I know her well. She is the CEO of an organization in New York City called Women's Presidents Organization that supports women CEOs all over the world. And she wrote an article recently, and I said, can I include this in my talk? And she said, all right. For National Dyslexia Week, she said, having dyslexia forced me to see things differently. I had to listen more carefully to understand. I had to put an emphasis on relationships in a way. Having dyslexia has given me advantages in life. Now, can she read? Yes. Did she go through interventions to read? Yes. Were they these targeted interventions? Yes. And very adaptive and very individualized? Yes, she was kind of lucky because that was my area of expertise. But she also has the other talents, and she wasn't discouraged by having trouble reading or having to go through this. And that's the advantage. And we see it across the country. If you look at high poverty districts and we follow them longitudinally, after they use this kind of intervention in addition with their excellent curriculums, you see reading gains that continue and continue and continue. You see it across subject areas, because if a student is having trouble reading, they're going to have trouble with science, they're going to have trouble with social studies. And what we see is when they read well, all of those academic areas are areas that they do well in, not just reading. So how does it work? Well, there's an assessment a student takes. They're then assigned to individual exercises that meet their needs. It adapts based on how well they do on each exercise. So if you had a room with 20 students and they were all doing this together, you would see within a few days, each student would be progressing in a different way and would be showing different kinds of skill sets. And then you get those reports that tells you all of that information, where a student is having trouble, where they're not, how they're progressing, so the teacher can use that as well and figure out other individualized approaches with the student. So instead of spending hours away from class activities or hours after school working with a tutor, students with dyslexia can quickly build cognitive and learning skills needed to benefit from classroom instruction. And not only that, They can participate effectively in other classroom activities and extracurricular activities. They're not at a tutor all day, where they can excel and show off their many other skills. So to learn more, you can go to carnegielearning.com, fast forward, and you can click on here and let us know what you think of the course and get your certificate. And I turn it back over to Corey, and we can take a few questions, I think.
Thank you so much, Marty. We really appreciate all you've done. I love the new information that you've shared. One question that came in was, are there versions of these software programs aimed at teen learners?
Yes, there are. So the original programs were developed for elementary grade, but we had the neuroscientists went in and developed programs that would get at these same skills for middle school and high school students, and those versions of it are called Elements. So Fast Forward Foundations is a set of the exercises that works on temporal processing, working memory, cognitive skills, and alphabetics and language comprehension for elementary students. And then Elements is a version that works for high school students. And then we also have reading comprehension and other reading exercises that focus more specifically on things like decoding or word recognition. So good question.
Great. And I'm going to try to put a link to Fast Forward information in the chat. We'll try one more time, but I'm also putting together a document with all of the links and for you that I'll put hopefully somewhere, or we can email it to you as well. And one more question, can we say that these strategies would benefit all students in a class and not just students with dyslexia?
Well, that is a $64,000 question. Because as a neuroscientist, exercising the brain for cognitive skills benefits all of us. The big question is, do we want the student, though, who's not struggling with reading, to take time away from instruction? And where we kind of come to is that let's reserve these for students who could they do it after school? Yes, but I'd also like to have them socialize. So if a student's not having trouble with reading, you could put them on it. We have evidence that it would really help them. We have schools that have done that. But I feel strongly that they will benefit from the curriculum more and from the good classroom experiences. So I would reserve these exercises primarily for students who are struggling, but only as long as they're struggling.
All right, another question. What about the Wilson reading program?
Okay, so Wilson, there are lots of programs that are based on Orton Gillingham, and Wilson is one of them. It's been around for a long time. It's an excellent curriculum. It's an excellent approach to teaching reading. It is phonics based, so you're teaching decoding. It gets at one very important aspect of reading that we know both from the simple view and the active view of reading. But keep in mind, it's getting at one. We still have other aspects of reading that we want to focus on as well.
All right, thank you. And then the last one I have, which times up pretty well, is what is the optimal time to be spent weekly for students on Fast Forward?
Okay, that's another $64,000 question. And because we all have different brains, what I'm going to tell you is some students should do it more intensely than others. Generally speaking, what we found is if students do it 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week, they do benefit dramatically after about a semester of working on it. And we show some major gains. So that would be what I would call the minimum of what you would want for intervention, would be 3 times a week, 30 minutes a day. If a student is very behind and it's possible for them to do 30 minutes 5 times a week, that's really ideal because it will move faster and they will make a lot more gains a lot more quickly.
Excellent. And as one who has used Fast Forward, I can tell you that it made just unbelievable differences for my students, and we found time to get those minutes in daily to get it done, because the great thing about Fast Forward is once they complete what they need, the number of components each student needs, they don't need to go back and revisit it year after year after year. And that's huge for those of us who have been in education and know that we plug kids into the same program time and time again, still not making the gains that they need to make.
Exactly. And one of the advantages is, as you really pointed out, after students go through Fast Forward, the learning experience themselves is exercising their brain now. So that's why you don't have to keep doing it, because you're sitting there reading, you're sitting there learning, you're sitting there listening to your teacher, you're sitting there utilizing all those brain structures. I will say in adults, if you do cognitive training, often you have to go back and revisit it if they don't use the skills. But students are getting 30 hours a week of tremendous instruction, and that they're really using those skills. So they get to keep practicing them and build and build and build.
And that's why it is so popular with people who have used it and seen what it does for their students. And we have some of those people on this call today. So we thank everyone for being here today. We have a few more questions. Somebody asked again, 5 days a week, and how many minutes per session?
30 minutes right now. But what I will say is we keep trying to work on this and revising it a little bit so that we're hoping to get even more efficient than that. But right now, with the way the program works, what we want is a minimum of 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week.
All right, so I have tried to put in the chat the link to Fast Forward and then the document that I put together with the link to access the certificate and the survey. Can someone let me know if you were able to access that?
I'll try right now.
Okay, we've had a few more questions, and since we have a few more minutes, I'm going to hop onto those. It says I'm on the website now. Are there price point aimed at individual family purchases? No, these are licenses for school districts, but we do have private providers that you can look on the website and connect with private providers sometimes to be able to access it for your personal children. Someone asked Marty about a hearing impaired student. What about for them?
Okay, that's a really good question. We've used it with students with cochlear implants. We've used it with students who have hearing aids. They need an audiologist usually to make sure that it's fitted appropriately so that either their hearing aid can directly connect into the program, or they have a way. You don't want to put headphones over hearing aids ordinarily. But we have some excellent results with individuals who have known auditory processing problems, cochlear implants. We had a whole series of research studies on students with cochlear implants and other students who have hearing impairment.
All right, thank you. Well, I've had some people respond and say they were able to get everything, but some people could not access the document. So I'm going to put the request the certificate and the webinar survey link as well into the chat to give you those. We will email you the slide deck and the webinar recording, so you don't have to worry about going to look for that. You can just access that from your email. All right, another question. I'm a speech pathologist who uses Fast Forward with my patients and pairing the program with individual training for compensatory strategies that gives best results. So there's someone who does use Fast Forward as a provider. And so you could access someone like that to really help give your students not only Fast Forward, but that additional attention to help them use Fast Forward professor adequately and correctly.
And use it at home.
And use it at home. All right, then somebody's shared a link. John shared a link for private provider information in Europe, the UK, and Ireland. Okay, somebody asked, last question, what about a scanning pen for dyslexia? Does that help?
What about?
A scanning pen.
Oh,
Something that reads it.
a scanning pen. Oh, okay. There was that Southern accent.
I was trying
I heard
to
pen.
Pen.
I heard pen. A scanning pen. Sure. I mean, you can have books you can have audio books too. Does it help? Sure. It helps them because it compensates for their reading. But is it helping them read better? Probably not. It's helping them. Let's put it this way. It's not improving their reading skill, but it's getting them through text faster and more easily.
So it's a way to compensate.
It's a way to compensate, right?
So it'd be like a modification or an accommodation they might be allowed to use in school.
Sure.
But we're not going to be building the skills that we would hope to build.
Right.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate you being here with us today.
Thank you.
I know that all of you have enjoyed Marty's presentation just as much as I have. And I am going to keep this open so I can answer a few more questions that have come in that were not related to the webinar itself. So we thank you again for your time, and please fill out that survey for us. And we hope to see you next time.
Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.